Core input devices. Remember the IPO cycle that we looked at in the beginning nugget of this series? Input, processing, and output. It's the basic mechanic of any computer system. Earlier in the course, when we covered CPU and memory, we were dealing squarely with the processing side of the fence. When we discussed monitors and printers, we were looking at output. In this nugget, we turn our attention to the third and final phase of the IPO cycle, input. Specifically, we'll examine keyboard and mouse devices. I would say mice to refer to the mouse pointer in plural, but actually, believe it or not, according to the Microsoft Manual of Style, they say either mouse devices, or you can formulate that however you want to. Mice is generally reserved for the rodent. Next, we'll look at some other alternate, lesser seen core input devices, or at least input devices that you might not normally think as input devices. Digitizer tablets, touch screens, gamepads, and joysticks. Let's get working. The keyboard and mouse, of course, form the core or foundational input for any personal computer system. A standard PC keyboard is going to include the alphanumeric part, which takes one of a couple different basic key layouts. Talk about format wars. You have the QWERTY layout. QWERTY's called this because on the second row of the keyboard, beneath the numbers, the first several keys are in order, Q, W, E, R, T, Y. There's an alternate keyboard layout that some folks are really vociferous about, and that's called the Dvorak simplified layout. That's a completely different method of arranging the letters of the alphabet. Supposedly, Dvorak facilitates faster typing with fewer errors. If you read up the history of keyboard layouts, QWERTY layout was actually developed as a mechanism to make it more difficult for typists to type, and in so doing, forcing typists to slow down and be more careful. You can actually buy Dvorak keyboards. Windows and any modern operating system does allow you to change the keyboard layout, not only between, say, QWERTY and Dvorak, but also to support other language systems. It's easy to be ethnocentric, I've found, as a human being. You don't normally think unless, for instance, you do live in Europe or the Far East. What does the keyboard look for a typical Japanese user of Microsoft Windows, or Russian? Are they going to work with our Roman alphabet? No, they're not. They're going to have a localized keyboard where the keyboard itself is mapped appropriately for their language. Moreover, these individuals will use a version of Windows or Mac OS X or Linux that's regionalized to display output in their local language. The issue of regionalization is important for some IT departments, particularly those that support people in, you guessed it, multiple countries and continents. Another distinction we should be aware of with keyboards is the main keyboard areas I just told you about. You tend to have your arrow keys, up arrow, down arrow, left and right, that can be used to move the cursor around a document. They can be used when playing video games to control the character on screen. Function keys are up above the number keys. Function keys are especially important on laptop computers, I've found. We're going to look at some pictures in just a moment. We'll go into more detail on that. And finally, full-size keyboards have a numeric keypad off to the side to facilitate very rapid numeric data entry. Apple in particular sells keyboards, stock keyboards with some of their computers that do not include the keypad. I don't like that at all. I've been a fan of the keypad for a long, long time. Yet another distinction when discussing the keyboard in computers is the notion of a straight keyboard versus an ergonomic keyboard. Ergonomics, in particular workspace ergonomics, refers to how you orient your body with relation to the monitor, to the keyboard, to the mouse, to minimize stress on your joints, your bones, and your muscles. When you think about it, let's imagine this is a keyboard and we're sitting looking at that keyboard at our desk. Normally your arms come out at an angle, and then they cock again as your hands straighten out to make input on that keyboard. The idea behind an ergonomic keyboard, Microsoft was a pioneer in this space with their Microsoft Natural keyboards that literally split the keyboard in two. In my experience, you tend to either really like these ergo keyboards or you really hate them. I happen to be in the former camp. I have one right in front of me right now. I absolutely love ergonomic keyboards. Here's the idea. As you're typing, you can keep your hand and your wrist and your forearm in a straight line instead of, again, cocking them several times. That definitely has been shown to contribute to stress, repetitive stress injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome. When you're keeping all of your phalanges, to use the medical term, and your wrist and your forearm in a straight line, you're putting far less pressure on those parts. Now, what kind of connection is used with keyboards? Few different types, actually. The old school connector for the keyboard is the PS2 connector, and this looks like a little round circle with a few holes in it. Show you a picture of this in just a moment. PS2 is really old school. You'll find it on computers that date up to, I would say, 2002 or so, maybe even a little bit beyond that. But PS2 is a pretty clunky technology in my opinion, mainly because it's not a hot pluggable technology. That is to say, if you're using your computer and you were to accidentally unplug your keyboard from the PS2 port, guess what? There's no plugging it back in. Sometimes you can get away with it, but in most cases you'll have to restart the computer, plug in the keyboard in order to get the keyboard back. If we're dealing with wired keyboards, far and away the most popular interface is again the Universal Serial Bus, or USB. Bluetooth comes to the forefront, as does radio frequency, RF, short-range wireless. I happen to have a Microsoft keyboard and mouse combo that uses Bluetooth to give me wireless connectivity with both of those devices. Excellent way to do business if you want to reduce those snake-like cables from your keyboard and from your mouse going all over your desk. It's a cleaner way to work, gives you much more freedom. Let's hit up Google again to take a look at some pictures. One thing I've found teaching this course for you is that Google Images tends to give you some pretty fringe pictures when you look for technology. You note that we have a theme going here. When we look for computer case, we wind up with custom cases that look like Harley-Davidson choppers. When we look at webcams, we see these desk-mounted objects that remind us of space aliens from the great beyond. And now here we're looking at keyboards, and we see some traditional ones. This is a Microsoft wireless keyboard that employs a modification of their original ergonomic design. The original Microsoft Natural keyboards literally split the keyboard into two sections. This is kind of a compromise to support both traditionalists who are used to a complete straight keyboard and people like me who really love the ergo stuff. Again, this is a deck keyboard that you can get wacky keyboards just like you can get wacky computer cases and wacky webcams. This is a nice image because it gives us a schematic layout of a traditional full-sized keyboard. You see, as we talked before, you have your number keys, your alphanumeric keys, down by your space bar. If it's a recent keyboard, which I hope it is, you should have keys to facilitate work in Microsoft Windows. That is to say, this key right here with a Windows flag on it and its matching companion over here, when you strike that key without anything else, it should bring up your start menu. Microsoft Windows has a lot of really nifty shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts that you can use with the Windows key. Windows M, for instance, will minimize all windows on your screen. Top row, we have our escape key and our function keys. Function keys, as I said, are often used for predefined functions. F1 historically has been used to invoke online help in whatever is your foreground application. In laptop computers, function keys take on different roles, for instance, being able to switch between the built-in laptop monitor and an external projection screen if you're going to give a talk and, say, want to run a PowerPoint deck. In the middle area, or middle right, I should say, you have your scroll lock, your pause break, insert, page up, page down. I tend to not use those too much besides just home, end, and delete. Our arrow keys, and then over on our right we have our numeric keypad. Numlock is important because depending upon whether your numlock is turned on or off, this gives you either access to the numeric keypad, or the alternative state is to use the keypad as arrow keys. You notice that these keys are superimposed not only with numbers but with arrows, so you can control your mouse pointer with that as well. If you're wondering what the Dvorak keyboard looks like, here it is. At first blush, you think, well, that's the QWERTY keyboard. But then you look for the QWERTY row, and you see pretty much the only key that's still standing is the Y. Ergonomic keyboards, this is a magnified image of a truly split Microsoft Natural keyboard. Like I said, people tend to be of two camps here. They either really, really love it, or they really, really can't stand it and feel out of their element. This is what a PS2 connector looks like. You notice that there are actual metal pins in there. This is something else that folks like me, old stodgy folks in other words, get really ticked off about. These pins can get bent awfully easily if, for instance, you're impatient and you try to jam the connector into the port on the back of the PC and you have it upside down, for instance. Happens all the time, believe me. One thing that's kind of nice about these, at least if you have normal color perception, is that the computer industry has standardized their colors such that the keyboard PS2 connector is, I guess this is a blue, and mice are, I guess this is a green. I'm very colorblind, I have to guess. And you notice that there's a little imprint of a keyboard on the keyboard one and an imprint of a mouse on a mouse one. Speaking of mice, let's come back to our whiteboard and take a look at this. The mouse is our core pointing device for windowing operating systems. There are two main types of mouse, only one is in use anymore. The original mice were mechanical, and you see this Logitech triple button mouse is an example of that design. If you look here, there's a rubber ball that as you roll the mouse across your table or your mouse pad, these little tracking sensors determine the X and Y coordinates of the ball at any point in time. And then your windowing operating system, such as Microsoft Windows, translates that into movement instructions for your on-screen pointer. Now, these devices tended to hook up again with PS2 connectors. You can get some USB mechanical mice, but like I said, you'd be very hard-pressed to purchase a new mechanical mouse nowadays. These rubber balls would get awfully dirty awfully quickly. They'd get all gummed up and just I have bad memories, quite frankly, of these mechanical mice. Much better solution now is the optical mouse, which gives you very smooth movement because there's no mechanical rubber ball there. We come out to Google again, yet again we see some wacky examples of these technologies. What is this? The bottom line with an optical mouse, here's a good example of a Microsoft mouse. Like I said, there's no ball, so there's no moving parts. The laser actually hits the surface, so you're not going to want to use one of these on a reflective surface like glass. But other than that, these optical mice are very forgiving as far as the surface that you use with them. You notice that some of these pictured have cords. Almost universally, it's USB bus, but quite a few are also wireless. So depends on what you're doing here. Apple has always been pretty much on the design edge of their mice. This one looks somewhat like the latest and greatest Apple mouse. Completely optical, Bluetooth wireless, and even though this looks just like a completely smooth surface up here, and it is, you actually have your left and right click ability, and you can actually, with the latest version of the Apple mouse, you can use finger gesturing. Like you can rest your index finger here and wipe back and forth to do horizontal scrolling, and instead of a roller wheel that you see on some mice, this guy here, you literally just do a gesture in a vertical direction here, rub the top of the mouse to scroll through web pages. Apple really does mice right, I have to admit. The next core input device we'll look at in this nugget is the digitizer tablet. Now, what are these? These are pressure-sensitive surfaces, as you see down in the lower right. This is a digitizer tablet, pretty high-end actually, by the company that's pretty much invented this technology, Wacom. It's a pressure-sensitive pad that allows artists, drafters, educators, basically anybody who wants this method of data entry into their PC to use a pen, a specialized stylus, to do that input. As a matter of fact, what you're seeing right now, me writing on this whiteboard, is the result of my work with a digitizer tablet. Especially the higher end models like these Wacoms, they come to be really large in size. I mean humongous, like maybe 1.5 feet at least, if not larger, for some of the most expensive models. And the pressure sensitivity is remarkable, just perhaps dozens or even hundreds of levels of sensitivity, such that when you use the digitizer pen on the surface of the pad, you get heavier strokes the more you press, lighter strokes the lighter you press. You see what I mean? You're getting a little example of that here as I put more and more oomph into the pen. Now, a question I always used to have is, isn't that kind of awkward because you're not seeing what you're writing on the screen itself? It's kind of like the learning curve of the touch typer. I mean, if you happen to be like me, a 9-finger touch typist, you're used to finding home row position on your keyboard and never looking at your keys, but instead watching the monitor. It's the same thing with these Wacom tablets. Once you get used to watching the monitor and not looking down, it becomes actually pretty nice. And if I had illustrative ability, I'm sure I could maybe forge a second career for myself. But I happen to not be artistic in that way. Digitizer tablets, I haven't seen a wireless one. Almost always, if not always, we're talking about a USB interface. As I said, they come in a variety of sizes, little tiny ones that can almost fit in your jacket pocket to humongous. What you do is you plug them in, you need the appropriate driver to instruct your operating system on how to interface with the digitizer tablet, and then you need some software to help you get off the ground. There's lots of drawing software packages out there. One that I have some experience with that I would recommend is Corel Painter. This, like most drawing software packages, integrates just fine with your digitizer tablet, and it has a layout that's somewhat similar to the Adobe applications. Adobe Illustrator would be another great application to use with this if you so wish. Now more than ever, we have touch as a core input method with computer hardware. Certainly Apple has done much to accelerate the use of the touch screen. We have other vendors, in particular e-reader hardware vendors. Amazon with their Kindle, Barnes & Noble has the Nook e-reader device. Certainly any smartphone manufacturer worth its salt nowadays is not going to require you to use a stylus pen to do input like we had in the old Palm Pilot days. Touchscreen is actually an input and an output device. It provides a really intimate connection between the user and the computer, doesn't it? Because the user has a tactile connection, tactile meaning a touch-based connection, and is directing the computer to give output based on that tactile input. So I mentioned we see touch screens in smartphones and e-readers. We also see touch screens in areas that you might not think offhand is a touch, but of course it is. It's just maybe you didn't think of it that way. Think of gas pumps. I pumped my gas tonight and I actually used a touch screen to select my debit card and enter my PIN. Those are perhaps less frequent. I tend to find hard keyboards or hard numeric keypads on those devices. Point of sale terminals, certainly in any department store, or maybe not a department store, but a grocery store, is going to have an area for self-checkout. Those are touch screen terminals. Digital cameras, I was a little bit surprised recently when I visited my twin sister Trish in upstate New York. She asked me to troubleshoot her digital camera. It was just this brand new, shiny new object. And I'm looking for some hard buttons to get into the configuration menu, and it took me a moment to put together that the screen on this guy was completely touch-based. Very nice way to do business if you're expecting it. I mentioned that you can use the numeric keypad like a calculator or like a mouse. The status of the numlock key is important here. If the numlock is turned on, you have your numeric keypad active proper to do number input. If you turn off numlock, you'll find that the numbers on the numeric keypad no longer work, but instead you can control the cursor on screen. Let's take a look at some point-of-sale touch screens. Hotels, that's another place where I often see these. You can do self-check-in, self-check-out. At the airport, you can often do check-ins using touchscreen interfaces. This looks like something you'd see in a restaurant. Nowadays, it's pretty common for you to see your server go over and cash you out by using a touchscreen on their own private point-of-sale systems. E-readers are another vector for touchscreen. I happen to have one of these. This is the Sony PRS 505 e-ink reader. It's a good device. Of course, the iPhone, the iPad, there's another Sony reader. The Amazon Kindle would be yet another example of an e-reader. All of these give us that notion of touch. Looking at the iPad, this is a great device. The iBook format in particular is, to me, just about, if not indistinguishable from a paper book, except, of course, the paper book is not as portable. And if you've ever seen these, you actually use a finger swipe gesture to turn pages on these e-readers like the iPad. And what's particularly amazing to me about the iPad iBook format is you can literally curl a page halfway back, and Apple put so much detail into this. You can actually see the text that's on the front page reversed on the other virtual side of that virtual page. You see what I mean? Amazing. Amazing stuff. Our final subject is game input. Games probably aren't de rigueur in the business world, but certainly for residential folks, home-based users, these folks are by and large, with kids or even without kids, interested in how to hook up game controllers to a PC. First of all, let's get our vocabulary down. A gamepad and a joystick are a little bit confusing. I personally, when I think of a joystick, I think of a controller like what you're seeing in the lower right, very redolent of the old arcade controls from the early 1980s. However, in industry, sometimes you'll see the terms gamepad and joystick combined. And I think that's for a fairly good reason. If you look in the upper right, this is a Nostromo N45 controller. I have one of these, and it's just as good as any PS3 controller out there. Almost any gamepad or joystick worth its salt is going to use USB connectivity or possibly Bluetooth wireless. Used to be, back in the olden days, several years ago, in the 90s, considered the olden days with this kind of technology, there was a dedicated game port on most PCs. It was a serial connection. Again, slow, clunky. You couldn't hot plug it. You had to have the joystick plugged in when the computer was powered off and then boot the computer up. As opposed to now with USB, you can have the computer up and online, decide, hey, I want to plug in my gamepad and play some games. Plug it in, driver loads, and you're good to go. Anyway, the Nostromo here is an example of a gamepad where you can see immediately, I hope, if you've used console video game controllers like Xbox 360 or PlayStation, that we have these grip handles, we have the what's called D-pad or digital or directional pad, some action buttons, and you do have honest-to-goodness joysticks here, not one but two. So that's why the wording is a little bit confusing at parts, especially when you're an old salt with games and you have another idea of what a joystick is. Specialty game controllers include things like flight yokes, steering wheels, and first-person shooter-specific controls. The issue of flight simulation in computers is a big subject, as is racing. There are flight clubs online, there are racing clubs online, and if you want to maximize the simulation experience, it stands to reason that you'll want a specialty game controller to suit that need. Going back to Google, you can see some of these are pretty sophisticated. This is a USB flight yoke that can be used with flight simulator software. Sometimes you get many pieces. You get rudders and pedal controls in addition to the upper level controls. You're going to pay a premium price for that though. Here are some Microsoft pieces, Microsoft steering wheel. This is for the Xbox 360 that comes with an accelerator and brake pedal. That looks pretty fun, actually. And this is kind of crazy. It looks like an individual set up their living room as a racing setup. Wow, that has got to be pretty fun. And then finally, with PC gaming, first-person shooters tend to be particularly popular. It's an important genre. There are controls that are maximized or set up in such a way to supposedly facilitate first-person shooting or first-person gaming. A lot of different form factors here. Some look kind of different. I don't know if I'd particularly like it. Here's a wireless first-person shooter controller for the PlayStation 3. Finally, I mentioned that the original old-school joysticks and gamepads used a custom port that's called the game port or joystick port. It looks like a larger serial port, if any of you are familiar with the traditional serial port interface. We don't need to concern ourselves with the pinout or anything. How those manifest themselves in computers at the time, it was either you'd have a motherboard that has an integrated joystick port, or for instance, you could get a sound card, an upgraded audio card that you'd snap into an ISA or potentially PCI slot on your motherboard that gave you one of those game ports. Something else that's really important to know in industry is that you can take pretty much any kind of connector interface under the sun and find a converter for it. Now, when we talked about hard drives, remember there was the parallel ATA, also called IDE, and the serial ATA standards. Well, there are actually connectors that enable you to convert a drive of one type to another. What you're seeing in this first picture is a connector that takes a gamepad, an old school GamePort gamepad, and turns it into a USB device. Some gamers are just attached to their older interfaces. You can also take male cable ends and convert them to female, female to male. There's nothing more frustrating than hooking up new hardware in a server room, for instance, and discovering that your cable is the wrong gender. Boy, that's frustrating. Final thing I want to show you is this picture here that shows the back plane of a PC. Not only do you have the, I don't know if this is yellow, gold, or orange, but you have the game port there. Look up above. We have our PS2 connectors. This is an older PC. Absolutely. If you were to look at this PC, you should know immediately this is super old school. This is the printer port or parallel port. These are the serial ports, old school for connecting modems and mice. Here's our gamepad port, and we're using PS2. I'm actually surprised to see USB ports on the back of this computer. This is an old box, believe me. This final jack is an RJ45 Ethernet port, as we've discussed earlier in the course. Core Input Devices Review. In this nugget, we started with looking at the variant keyboard and mouse device types. I hope that you're much clearer on why there is a variation of these. Maybe you never thought too much about keyboards or mice at this point, but certainly now you have some food for thought. We then examined some more specialty input devices like the digitizer tablet. We examined touch screens in business and residential contexts, and then gamepads and joysticks. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.